This is our monthly ReadyAPI 101 class, SmartBear Academy. We'll be hosting our second user conference this year. It's going to be in Boston again. It's going to be in downtown Boston, October 29th and 30th. And right now we are actively looking for speakers. So anyone out there with a compelling story, you've been using the product for months, for years, we want to hear from you. So we really are interested in having our customers experience, tell us their story, how they're using the product, how you're building a team with the product, whatever it might be. And that's all I have. I'm going to hand it over to Stephen, our technical engineer, is going to be running the class today, go a little bit over the history of SmartBear and into the agenda and right into the training for you, what you're all here for. So thank you, everyone, for joining.
All right. Again, welcome, everyone. I'll periodically be pausing and answering questions. I want to make this something a bit more interactive so that we can have a conversation about the product and what we're looking at. So a little background on SmartBear itself. We have over 400 different employees and we cover over 190 different countries in terms of our customer base. Now, lag on our slides here. So yeah. Hold on a second. All right, are we back? Yeah, I think so.
There it is. All right, we're good.
Okay, there we go. We were founded about 10 years ago with one of our bigger legacy products being SoapUI. We still maintain a very good connection to the open source community through our SoapUI open source and our Swagger initiative that we donated to OpenAPI. And if we move to the next slide. We're having a little lag here, but in this next slide, I want to talk about more of the life cycle of software development that we as a company cover with our software profile. If you look at the vertical axis, you can see it goes from dev, test to ops. So we have players in each of those spaces. And then horizontally, vertical is UI to API, and vertical is dev, test, and ops. So starting at the dev UI section, we have Collaborator, which is our code review tool. You can start testing your UI with our product Test Complete. You can manage your tests using real devices that we have in our offices with cross-browser testing. And you can also stress test, load test these UIs with Load Complete. Going into the middle section, we have QA Complete for managing these manual and automated tests on both the UI and API side. And on Alert Site, we have our real-time API monitoring product. And this integrates very well with the products we're going to talk about, SoapUI Pro and LoadUI. And then in our API layer, we have Swagger Hub, which is our design-first collaboration tool for designing Swagger specifications. SoapUI Pro, which is for creating automated API functional tests, and we'll talk more about that. ServiceV Pro, which is for virtualizing API and database services. And LoadUI Pro, which is our performance testing for the API tests. All right. All right, so that's a lot of information here. And across all of our products, we integrate with a lot of different services like Jenkins and AWS. Now to move on to our agenda, we're gonna be talking about SoapUI Pro. For most of the time, we're gonna talk about importing an API, what the project structure looks like, and then go into building a test and those different validations. And then I'm gonna show you some of our features like data-driven testing and our reporting and automation. Then we'll go into LoadUI Pro, and what I really want to show you there is how quickly from SoapUI Pro you can spin up load tests and some of the validations you can see there. And then we'll go into ServiceV. And again, like the whole ReadyAPI platform, a lot of the information we already saw is reusable. So I'll show you how to create a virtualized API, how to reuse the APIs you already have in your project. And then I'll talk about Virtual Server, which is a different product that works in tandem with ServiceV. And I will parse that out when I get there. All right. So let me share my screen here. point to the right screen. All right, so right now we're looking at the ReadyAPI Dashboard. This is just an in-product dashboard that across all the products, we can see different test suite statuses for, 7 days, 30 days behind us. And this is just a really cool first view. Just to orient yourself, on the top right, you can actually see the different products that are there. So you'll see we'll start with actually this projects tab and talk about how you can visualize and explore your API there. Then we'll move on to SoapUI Pro, LoadUI, and ServiceV. So you'll see that us going through the product. All right. So to kick off a new project, we can actually import an API in several different ways. The first way is through a URL. This is, maybe you have access to the endpoint, but you don't actually have the service definition. You can use this route. Or if you actually have the service definition, we offer WSDL definition support, Waddle, Swagger, and OAS3, and a RAML definition support. So you have a lot of different options to do that. And one thing to note is within one project, you can have a mix of SOAP and REST services. So although it's called SoapUI Pro, we enable you to test both kinds of services within the same project. Our next option is our REST discovery option, which a lot of our customers find interesting. There's two options here. The first one is using ReadyAPI as a proxy so that between two machines, ReadyAPI will record traffic and create an inferred service definition from that. With this option, we have a lot of options in terms of not having a service definition or not having access to a specific endpoint. Now, if it's a browser-based app that has a service definition behind it, but we don't have access to it, we can actually use this built-in browser. So I'll show you a quick example here where I can actually start doing different calls. I'll just go to our website here. And we can see that if I hit done, all that traffic from just that one call was recorded. We can see what was happening in the backend. And I can create a service definition from that. So while it won't be complete, it can give your testers enough information to start building your testing workflow against it. Okay. So for right now, I'm going to use a URL. I'm going to use I'm going to use Google Maps API. And we can see I have a couple of parameters here. And what ReadyAPI will do is take that and give us this screen. So we've moved on to the projects tab here. We can see the address query parameter set up and the key parameter. This is just an, excuse me, an API key that we need to put in here. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that this XML resource can actually be parameterized further with ReadyAPI. So if we go ahead and add a format template parameter, we can see that that XML was replaced. And now I can either put XML or JSON. I'm going to choose JSON since I like how it looks a little better. In terms of the key, we can go to the project level and set up what is called a custom property. So with this custom property, I can say, I'll call it API key. And then let me pull in the value from off screen. All right, got the key value here. And now this property will be available to any request that's within the project. All I need to do is use our point and click get data tool, which I'll talk more about when we go into SoapUI Pro, to pull out that API key. Now I can do some exploratory search and just run the request. I see that we have information created. I can't start creating validations yet, but this is a good space to just look at your API, look at the different operations that are available before you start adding it to a test case. All right. So there was actually a great question on using the REST discovery for a password protected site. So it's an internal browser. It's going to look like any browser you're doing. So you'll get that password prompt. You can fill in your password and you can start doing the discovery through there. And if it's with HTTPS, we have some methods to allow you to do discovery with HTTPS websites as well. So that's something that you can try out as well. All right, so we have this structure. We have our API imported. Now we want to actually start building a testing workflow against it. All you need to do is click Add to Test Case. I have nothing created, so I'll just create a new test suite and test case. I'll give this a relevant name. And now we're moved on to SoapUI Pro. We can see that all the information that I created within the Projects tab has been imported. And one thing I want to note is that if I make any changes in the Projects tab in terms of parameters, that will propagate through every product that uses that request. So let's say I use this Google Maps request for 50 different test cases. I don't need to worry about going through every single test case to try to update my workflow. That's something that ReadyAPI enables you to do in a very automatic fashion. All right. So at the bottom of this screen, we can see our validations menu. ReadyAPI has over 15 different assertions that range from compliance for contract testing, SLA for responsiveness of the API, or you can actually assert against the content of an XML or JSON response, or just for the existence of a node in that response. What I'm currently going to do here is just add a valid HTTP status code assertion, which is 200, and I'll run the request. We can see that this is green, which signifies it passed, which is good. And we have our actual response information. One thing we can do within SoapUI Pro to make creating complex validations a lot easier is in this outline editor, we can actually select nodes and add assertions for it. So I'm going to add a for content assertion for the status element, and the expected result will be OK. So I hit save, everything works. And now as I start building out this workflow, I can rest assured that the status will return OK, or ReadyAPI will flag that for us, and we can look into what's wrong at that time. So that's our validations. So we have another question. Record, discover HTTPS request without using the internal browser. So unfortunately, I can't show that at this time. What that step looks like is you set up ReadyAPI as the proxy, and we provide a certificate that you need to embed in your machine that will let you read that traffic. So unfortunately, I don't have that configured to show you, but that's something that you can look up the documentation on HTTPS or internal browser or the proxy and look at that very quickly. So. All right, so we have this one request. We have our test case built out a little bit. We have some validation on top of it. Now, what I want to show you is our data-driven testing feature. So I have this Excel file that has a bunch of city names, and one of them is some bad information there. What I want to do in ReadyAPI is pull in that information, iterate through every city name, and pull it into the request. This is done with two of our test steps, a data source and data source loop test step. Now, to take a step back, SoapUI Pro has over 10 different test steps that range from many different kinds of requests, GroovyScript test step, different MQTT WebSocket requests. And with that, you can build out very complex workflows with just the UI. And we have a question about the key being a mandatory element for the URL. That's just something that's specific to our Google Maps API. That's not something that is always mandatory. That's just how Google set up their system. That's a great question. All right, so we have this data source and data source loop test step. what the data source will do is actually pull out the information from the Excel file, and the data source loop will just mark the next iteration, and we'll see how that's configured in a moment. So let's add a test step. Let's add the data source. I'm gonna give it a proper name. We wanna make sure that the data source is the first step. Now, in terms of using external data sets, I'm gonna show you how to use an Excel file. You can also use a CSV file or directory. You can use a grid, which is an internal spreadsheet. You can use a script if you want to script out something more specific. You can use our data generator, which actually lets you create random custom strings or random cities or random times. There's quite a few different options within our random data generator. You can use JSON and XML information from previous requests. So now you can have big JSON responses that you can iterate through with a data source. And you can use our JDBC connection. Now, SoapUI Pro has support for all databases that have JDBC interfaces connected to them. That includes all of the big SQL database providers and even some of the NoSQL database providers. Now, just because I'm predicting a question that might come up, in terms of the NoSQL databases, if it has a JDBC interface, you can use this, or you can use the scripting option to manually connect to the database as well. I've seen a lot of customers do that. And it still provides a seamless experience. It just requires a couple of lines of script. All right, so I'm gonna set up this Excel data source. I'm gonna browse to my cities Excel file. That was actually off screen, sorry I didn't pull that over. And what we see here is that row will be automatically imported into a property, a data source property, right? So we have that city property created. I want to start at the second cell because that's where the information actually is. And I hit OK, and we can see that that information is automatically pulled in to our data source. One thing I want to note here is that if I increase my Excel file to 100 different data points, I don't need to do any more configuration here. That'll just get pulled in and iterated against when I run the testing workflow after that change. Currently, we only have about 6 or 7 different cities. All right. Now let me just go ahead and save this project file very quickly. All right. So now we have this data source configured. Within the actual request, we want to pull in that city's property as we're iterating through with our data-driven testing. So using our point and click testing, our get data tool, we can see that ReadyAPI lets you pull out any information at the test suite, test case, or test step level. So we can see up here, we have our API key. And as I navigate through my project structure, I can see the cities and city data source property. So I'll hit add. We'll have the syntax that's created, which just signifies to pull the data source property. And I can run this, but all that will happen is the last row of that data source gets pulled in. It's not a true data-driven testing workflow yet. So let me add this data source loop here. And to finish off our data-driven testing workflow, I just need to indicate the data source step and the reference target step for the iteration. And we can see in our test case that we have this looping structure that sort of lets us visualize what's going on in our workflow. Now, data sources and data-driven testing is a very flexible structure. You can nest data sources together to create complex workflows. So you can do that very easily. All right. So now I'm just gonna run this, but before I do that, something specifically with this Google test case, I wanna add a delay so that between each iteration, there's some downtime. because I've realized that with my Google Maps API, I'll get an over query limit. So I don't want Google to get mad at me, so I'm just going to add this delay. And now we can see it'll start iterating and running through. And while this is happening, I'll take a look at our chat here. So I'm not sure what Teradata is, but if it has a JDBC jar file, meaning it has a JDBC interface, then we support it. You just need to have the connection string and that JDBC jar file, and you can do that, all right? And that's something you can look at our documentation online for more information. But unfortunately, I'm not specifically familiar with Teradata. And we have a bit of a longer question. When you use SLA for assertion, sometimes the API engine might not be up and running. So the first time the test fails, and from the second time onwards, it fails under the SLA. How do you test that, since it will fail the first time if you are the first user to hit the API? So that's a good question. There's actually a test step called a conditional go-to test step that you can possibly use to run the API request again. That failure will trigger, but you can maybe automatically run that test step again. Or you can use a scripting function to sort of look at the status of the request, and if it failed, run that request again. So there's a couple options there, and SoapUI Pro is very flexible, excuse me. But yeah, so there's a couple of options there. So that's what I recommend exploring for your use case here. Okay, so the conditional go-to test step or a script. All right, so we see this data-driven iteration is ran. It ran about 7 different times. Now, something I baked in was a failure. This is something I did on purpose for our demonstration. And what I really want to show you is that although I'm adding this external data set that can be 100, 200 rows long, in SoapUI Pro, you can still very quickly look at what the failure was and start assessing where the failure is occurring. So I'm going to hop on over to our transaction log. And for every data-driven iteration, I can look at every single test step. I can also filter by the failed test step. And I see the Google Maps request failed once. I can do some further exploration. And I see our assertion message that shows that the status was expected as the OK value, which is a validation we set up previously. But the actual value was 0 results. And if we look at the actual message exchange, we can look at the raw request and raw response, where we see this address is this negative data I put in is just mumbo jumbo. It's not an actual city. And the status result was actually 0 results. So while a failure did occur, this is what I was expecting from the Google Maps API. So that's our transaction log feature. Now, let's say you have a very complex workflow and you have multiple different API stakeholders that aren't using ReadyAPI in general. This can be managers for your team directly or other people in other teams that utilize your API internally. One thing you can use in ReadyAPI is our advanced reporting feature. Now, at the project, test suite, and test case level, you can create PDF reports. You can also create JUnit style and HTML reports, or just do a data export. So I'm going to show you this test case report. It'll take a couple of seconds here. And let me just pull that onto the shared screen. So this is a PDF that SoapUI Pro generated for us. We have our metadata about what test case we're running. We have some basic metrics. We go through we can see the different test steps. We can see the transaction log in the similar way. And we can see that assertion failure message, which is in a very clear way. So it's very easy to understand what kind of failure was occurring. And then if the person viewing the report wants to dig a little deeper, you can actually look at the real-time request and response from that failed test step. So it's up to the person whoever is viewing this, but they have those options available. Now, this is a PDF. I can save this. I can email it off and very quickly, I can have several different people just sort of seeing the API's health in general in terms of functional testing. All right. So that's our report generation feature. We currently have a data-driven testing workflow. We generated a report off of that, all with just clicks, no scripting involved, but you have the option to script if you want to do something very complex, but that's for like very limited use cases that a lot of times our customers look at these test steps and validations and they see enough of what they need there. Okay. So let's see here. So the next thing I want to go over is our automation aspect. What I want to show you is with our automation, you can have all of these features, the data-driven testing, the report generation, all within a command line tool that you can integrate to any CI/CD environment that accepts command line output, which is almost every. So that's what I'll show you in a second. Let me take a quick look at our chat here. So we have an anonymous here. Can you use a single data source for all test steps within the test case or test suite? If so, can you show how? So this is within my test case level is all I can really use it for. But something you saw within the get data tool is that if I had a different test case, I can pull from a data source in another test case. But that's not really recommended as a best practice because that can be very difficult to manage. But if you have a complex enough use case where you're trying to do this cross-referencing, it's definitely possible. ReadyAPI, SoapUI Pro won't limit you in that fashion, but it's not really recommended. It's a lot easier to create a workflow within a test case that you can see what's going on, even if it's nested. If it's within the same test case, it's a lot easier to see. One thing you can do is parameterize this file field. So I can create a custom property that says file path and then have multiple data sources point to that custom property. So you'll have all these data sources that all point to one file. And if that file changes, it'll pull those changes in. And then you can have these multiple test cases using essentially one data source. That's a better practice in terms of how to set up a more centralized data source. All right, so I hope that answers your question. Next question from Jeff here. Can you support conditional assertions? The last failure should actually be a pass because it's expected. So we don't have conditional assertions in the sense that I think you're speaking of, but you can set up what I'm going to call them negative assertions. So I can actually use, let's say, status code. I can use an invalid HTTP status code so that it'll give me a pass if it's invalid or valid. So I can use them in different ways here. Yeah, so we don't really have conditional assertions in the same sense that I think you're speaking of, but you can take some exploration here and either see if you can set it up with our assertions or use a script assertion to create a more complex logic in which it seems like you're looking for. So again, SoapUI Pro will not limit you in any of this sort of validations. And at the very end of the day, you can write a script to do something, okay? So we have a couple of, can we use this tool to access the URL? Over 100 article pages launching at the same time. So it can be cached by CDN first before the customer can access it. So I'm not familiar with CDN, but as I've shown you through our projects tab, you can run API requests in the projects tab without an actual testing workflow. So if you're looking to create the test step and run it first to do some caching, you can do that. Or within this data-driven workflow, I can create a copy of this Google Maps request before the data-driven testing workflow so that it'll run a request once, then do that data source iteration. So I can actually clone this test step so that I can do it twice. So you have a couple of options there. So I'm not sure what the system is, but I understand what you're talking about with caching. So those are your options for that. All right. So in regards to the assertion, can you assert from a data set? Yes, so that's actually another option that Mark brought up. You can actually assert from a data set itself. So let me configure this. This won't make sense, but just for the sake of the example, you can use this get data function, and I can actually assert against the data source itself. In this case, it doesn't make any sense to do that, but that's an option we do have. All right, so that's a great question. You can assert against data sets. Let me set this back up, hit save. All right, so let's move on. Let's look at our automation. So as I said before, it is a command line runner called test runner. SoapUI Pro ReadyAPI is built on the JVM, so it works on every operating system. If you're on Windows, it's testrunner.bat. And if you're on Unix or basically Linux or Mac, it'll be testrunner.sh. So it has over 20 different arguments so that you can have all of this functionality. But in SoapUI Pro, you can use this launch test runner tool to look at all the arguments available through a UI. So I can see the test suite test case. I can see the different examples. I can see what reports I want to generate, and then what properties, tags, or custom arguments I want to bring in. So I'm just going to launch this. And as I said before, because it's a command line tool, it's actually CI/CD agnostic. So what I'll show you here is our command line that's generated. We have our tool. We have the test suite, test case, the report, the environment, and then the project XML file. So now all I need to do to set it up in something like Jenkins is copy and paste this testrunner.bat command into that Jenkins job. And what I need on those specific nodes is an installation of ReadyAPI. So I have the testrunner.bat tool and the project file. Okay, so that's all I need. And now I can start kicking off automated tests without losing any of the functionality that I've seen here that I found so valuable, like our data-driven testing and the dynamic get data tool. All right. So that's SoapUI Pro at a very high level. We talked about a lot of the different things going from importing an API to visualizing the API in the projects tab to actually building out the test case, validations, and involving external data sets. Again, all without script, right? I'm just clicking, and within about 30 minutes, we have this workflow set up. And then we went into reporting and automation. So that's SoapUI Pro at a high level. I want to take a brief pause here and open it up for any questions you guys might have. We've been having great interactions thus far, and that's really great. So let's take 2 minutes and see if we get any questions here. All right, so in case the server or provider I am hitting is not available, and I want to mock the response of the provider, either for SOAP or REST, how do we do that? That's a great question. And I don't know if we planted you in the audience, but when we talk about ServiceV, that's exactly what I'm going to show you. If you have an internal dependency, that's something that you can mock up very quickly and actually have a localized version, which we call a vert, that you can still build your testing workflow against. So that's a great question. We're not going to get to it until ServiceV, but at that point, if you're saying you want to flesh that out a little more, feel free to ping the chat again and we can talk about it. All right. All right. Wait another minute here, see if anyone else has any questions before we move on. Just to give you a look into the future of this webinar, I'm going to show you how with a click, we're going to create a load test and start configuring a load test very quickly. So we'll look at LoadUI Pro and what that product has to offer. All right, so say for example, the API is down and we try to run a test suite of 100 data points. Will it run all 100, then the result of failure, or abort the test run? So you can actually configure the test case in a couple of different ways. I can either, let me just show the actual option here. I can use this abort test if an error occurs, or just have it marked as a failure. So it really depends on your testing workflow. Maybe you want it to just run so that you can see all those different failures, or you just want it to abort because you don't want to waste your time and you just want to see what that first response was, that first error. So you have that option in ReadyAPI. Great question. At the end of the session, are you going to share the recording with the participants? Yes, we will be sharing a recording of this so that you guys can look it over. We know it's a lot of information, and this is something you can utilize, open up your ReadyAPI, open up the recording, and try doing some of the stuff that we're doing here currently. So yes, that will be shared. All right, so I have this functional testing, which is great. The next step actually, let me take a step back. Any limits to the data in an Excel data source? No. So the only sort of bottleneck would be time. You have to sort of expect that as it's iterating through more rows, it'll take more time. But there are no limits that SoapUI Pro will create on your data source itself. That's a great question. All right, so we have this functional testing workflow. It works out very well. My boss is happy, I'm happy, I get paid. So with this functional testing workflow, a lot of our customers who are doing this then say, now we want to do performance testing. Within ReadyAPI, we let you reuse these functional tests to actually start doing that with a couple of clicks. So on the test case, all we have to do is create load test. I'll give it a better name here. Load test. And we hit OK. Now we can see that it's brought into our LoadUI Pro section, and the test case is embedded within what we call a scenario. Now I'll dig into that in a second, but I want to show you the other options you have for creating a load test. So we have these templates that offer a good breadth of what a lot of load testers look to do, like a stress test, a soak test, or a spike. You maybe want to create some spikes. And for each one of these templates, we signify what the load will look like in terms of time and virtual users. We have the performance assertions that will be created automatically, and the different statistics that will be generated for you just with this template. So if you're sort of doing more of an exploratory search into what LoadUI has to offer, I recommend just using one of these templates and see what happens. In a more manual sense, you can import from a test case, a single request. So this is just from the APIs I have in this project, or a URL. Maybe it's something that is not currently represented in our functional testing workflow, but I want to create a load test against that. So you can do that as well. All right. So back to our Google Maps load test. Like I said before, we have this test case wrapped into a scenario. We can set the entire load test to run under any unit of time, being seconds, minutes, or hours. I'm going to set it for 30 seconds. And for each scenario, I can create a different load profile. A load profile is just a pattern of how your concurrent users will interact with your functional testing workflow. Currently, I'm just going to use fixed, which is just a set amount of virtual users for those 30 seconds. I can do ramp up, which will start with a base amount of users, and after a certain time, it'll ramp up to, let's say, go from 5 virtual users to 30 virtual users. Or I can create a custom one, and using this graph, I can sort of create what I want to see in terms of a load test. All right, so those are some of our options. We have quite a few here that you guys can explore. I'm currently only going to run 2 virtual users. As I said, this is the real Google Maps API. I don't want to get a message from them saying, Steven, what are you doing? You're overloading our servers. That won't happen, but you never know. And then this wait time, I'll just set to 0. But what that does is after each scenario is run, it will wait for a second. And that's very useful to simulate real user interactions. So let's say these APIs are for a mobile app, which is actually a real scenario I talked with a customer with. You can start simulating those real interactions where they click something, they're looking at something for 30 seconds, and then they click something else. And you can start mapping those real user scenarios. All right. So we talked about how to sort of configure a scenario. Now let's talk about the different assertions we can have. So these assertions are a little different from the functional testing assertions. These assertions are for the performance testing. So what I'm going to set up here is a failed test step assertion, which will actually look at the amount of failed test steps we have. But I can also do assertions on running virtual users, time taken, excuse me, and that sort of thing. So within our assertions, I'm just going to do it on a per second basis. This constraint will sort of let me know what, how many failed test steps specifically I want to see per second. I can use this to stop the test on the failure. So if I want to just cut off the load test, if I have 1,000 failed test steps, because that's really bad, I can do that. And I can also set a tolerance. So maybe we have a load test where we expect a couple of failures, but we don't want it flagged. I can set this tolerance level to mimic that. All right. So that's our validation. That's our assertion. Now, the last step to our load testing is setting up our transaction log. So when I click run on this load test, I can actually see what's happening in our transaction log. So I'm just going to configure it to output, to capture failures. ReadyAPI will do this automatically. It'll just be on this screen. And I'll show you that after we run the load test. So I'm going to hit run. We're going to see the global metrics and test step metrics start giving us that information of what's going on. And in real time, we can see how our API is doing. Are there any questions thus far about creating the load test, what a scenario is? Maybe you have some question about performance testing in general. Feel free to put it on the chat. So Anonymous said, how to validate validation messages on the app. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by on the app per se. So if you can clarify that, that'd be great. Yeah, validation messages. Yeah, so if you can put in a clarification onto the chat here, I'll be happy to answer, but I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. Maybe you can provide an example. So our load test is finished. Now, we can see, as I said, as I promised, we have our global metrics here. It's set up so that I'm seeing these failures that I baked in. It's spiking up, but I can also see the test step failures, which is the assertion that I set up. And I can take a look into what's going on. I can close some of these values if I just want to see the failures, or add some of the values like transactions per second or the average. All right. Now, what I want to show you next is how LoadUI offers a really good reporting generation feature akin to SoapUI Pro. So on this top here, we can generate a load test report, and we can add different things like test step history or statistic history if we set up statistics. So I hit OK here. Again, it'll take a second and it'll generate that PDF for us. Let me pull it over here. And in a very similar way, we see the load test results. We see the metadata in terms of what project was ran, what the scenario was. We continue, we can see information on the test cases, the load test assertions. We have these really nice pie graphs that very quickly I can just flip through this report and just understand it failed a lot because it's a huge chunk of the pie graph. And then we can see a summary of scenarios, the actual chart, which is what we saw in the actual product, some information about the test cases, and so on and so forth. So top 5 test case executions, some execution dispersion, which is sort of like the fastest and slowest test case executions that happen and where they happen specifically. And then we can see, you know, that history here. And then we see some of the terms that's used, because we understand that load testing has a lot of different terminology. So if you're giving this to an API stakeholder that may not understand the terminology presented, that's something they can look at. And this is a PDF report. So someone asked, the wait time is for the entire scenario. If yes, can it be a range? So this wait time is actually a static. It's not a range, and it's per scenario. For the entire load test, I can actually set up a warm-up time, which will be like before the load test runs, it waits a couple of seconds. But again, it's a static value and it's not a range. Great question. Can we run in non-GUI mode? If so, how to view graphs? So we do have a load test runner that's akin to our SoapUI test runner. For viewing graphs, however, what you're going to need to do is utilize our report generation feature so that at the end of the test run, you can see those reports and look at those graphs. So that's a great question. So you'll have to utilize our report generation feature. What are the prereq steps needed to be done for the PDF to be generated when the execution is complete? Also, can these results PDFs be configured to be emailed once the execution is completed? That's a great question, something I hear quite often. So looking at this UI, I can actually, if I don't know what arguments need to be added to run the different reports, I can just hit create reports here, select whatever format we want, what statistics we want. And let me open this up, cancel. And what we can see is that this is actually an argument. Oh, it's not wanting to cancel for me. This is actually an argument within our test runner file, okay? So that's sort of the prereq steps, is that you can use the UI to see what the argument is, and then just copying and pasting this into a Jenkins job, let's say. Okay, so this is just what it looks like as it's running. I canceled it, so it didn't really run. Now, in terms of being emailed once the execution is complete, ReadyAPI is just that command line runner. What you can do is utilize Jenkins to, after the workflow is done, you can use Jenkins email functionality to kick off an email notification and pull that test step report, or that load test report, sorry, from wherever you put it in the file system. So you actually will rely on Jenkins a little more to do that. That's not something that LoadUI Pro will do for you. So that's our getting started with load testing, going very quickly from SoapUI Pro to creating a load test. We can see, you know, the different metrics, and as I forgot to show you, this transaction log we set up. So I can see every failed test step and see the response, or the request and the response. So let me close that. Oh, it's not opening up here, but yeah, response here, right? So some of it was over query limit. I'm sorry, Google, for querying your API too much there. So that's LoadUI Pro. Now, I want to talk about some of the more advanced features in a very overview sense, so that when you're looking at doing your load testing, you can join our 201 seminars to learn more about it. So in LoadUI, you can actually create modular statistics and graphs, statistics in graphs or table format that you can then export into reports. So you're not just limited by whatever metrics we offer you. You can actually create your own custom statistics. You can monitor your server health using no extra software. You just connect to the server. This includes Windows, Unix, MongoDB, and you can overlay these server monitoring statistics like available megabytes for your processor over your load test performance statistics. So you're really expanding your load test to see your server health, because your API might fail, but your server CPU might be maxed out for the whole time, and that might be the issue. So that's something you can do in LoadUI. We also have distributed load testing with a small piece of software called a LoadUI agent for no extra charge at all. You can put up an agent on multiple different machines and actually start using those resources to do your load testing for you. Using LoadUI Pro as a command center, I can run something like 2,000 virtual users on a stronger machine than my laptop, and I can still see all the statistics created in LoadUI. This also integrates with Amazon EC2, so you can spin up servers in the cloud. And it's actually pretty cool where you add a geographical aspect to your load testing that will let you test the latency between a server, an Amazon server across the world, and your API server that might be in the office. Okay? So that's the advanced functionality that you can see in our 201 seminar. So I recommend, if you're really looking into performance testing, to join in on that. So that's LoadUI Pro. I want to take a second to answer some questions that we may have and to answer them before we move on to ServiceV. So someone asked, I want to test throttling with ReadyAPI. Is it possible to build a project in ReadyAPI that will send a request to a web service every 5 seconds? So one thing I showed you is that delay test step that's set up in milliseconds. So let's go back here. So with my testing workflow, I can up it to 5 seconds. Right now it's just 1 second. I can create those delays so that I don't want to overtax my API. So that's something you can definitely set up with SoapUI Pro. Oh, and just to clarify, so what ends up happening is, as I'm iterating, it'll wait 1 second before going to the next iteration. So you can combine this looping structure with that delay to do that. All right, so another question here from John. The functional tests in SoapUI are very difficult to merge in source control, work in tandem with team. Is there a better way on functional testing in teams? So I apologize that you've seen issues with our source control. So for anyone who doesn't know, ReadyAPI offers a Git plugin where you can start utilizing Git to have your project file in a more collaborative fashion, where you have several team members just pulling off different changes and putting it into the central repository. And in our latest plugin, we actually support branching, where you can start creating branches and that such. So John, while I don't have an answer for you currently, what I do recommend is that you submit a support ticket with some of the issues you've been having, so that we can make sure that, one, you're using the most updated Git plugin, because there have been a lot of changes and a lot of bug fixes to it that make that improvement, that make that more seamless for teams. And with our support team, we can just talk to you about what's going on, some of your challenges, and maybe give you more of a best practices sort of look at how to use the Git plugin. So that's something I recommend as a next step. You're welcome. All right, so that's SoapUI Pro going to LoadUI Pro. How very easy, scriptless. I'm not a good scripter, so this is an amazing product for me. Now I want to go into ServiceV, which is our service virtualization product in ReadyAPI. So I apologize, I forgot the name of the person who gave me the great leading question, but one of the great things about ServiceV is if you have any dependencies, either internally or externally, you can use what's called our route and record feature to create a localized version, which we call a vert, to stand up in your local machine or on your company's network with a vert server. And you can start using that in the interim. Maybe it's in maintenance, maybe it costs too much, so you just want a localized version. You can do that. And then you can even edit those responses. So this is ServiceV. We can create a new vert in a couple of different ways. The first is through a definition. In the same way, all the definitions that were supported before, or you can do it from an existing API in the project. You can create an empty SOAP, REST, JMS, or JDBC. So one thing that's cool is that we say it's service virtualization and not API virtualization, because you can actually virtualize your JMS and JDBC transactions. So I can have a virtual instance of a test database so that if that test database goes down because my DBAs have to maintain it in some way, I can utilize this localized version of it. Okay. Now to show you this record functionality, akin to our REST discovery feature, you use this internal browser. We're going to go to smartbear.com, my favorite website, and you can start doing actions on it and see what transactions are going on behind the scenes. So, and then you can select whichever transactions you want and create a new virtual service or add it to an existing virtual service so that you have the actual request response information. And then you can start editing it and modifying it in any way you see fit. Another thing you can do is going back to our projects tab. Let's say you're in this screen, you're looking at your request. Now you want to create a virtual instance of this request. You can select add to virt and then Google Maps virtual service here. Spelled that correctly, great. And we can see that it's pulled into a new virt, all right? Now, that's how you can reuse from APIs in your project. Now to orient you a little bit in what's going on this screen, we have our incoming section, which is the list of endpoints that our virtualized instance has. We have our dispatch style, and I'll talk more about that in a second. That basically tells ServiceV, tells the virt that how do I move from a request that came in to a response? And we have our list of outgoing responses. So I can add multiple different responses on top of the response that was recorded. And I'll show you what that section looks like in a bit. So here we have it. We have our resource path. We have our dispatch style. Currently it's set to sequence, meaning if you ping this several times and there's several responses, it'll just sequentially go down and restart. You can randomize that. You can build some intelligence into your virts by using something like query match, XPath, or parameter. So based on what the request has, maybe an ID parameter, you can route to different responses that way. And you can also build out a script dispatch style. So that works for any more complex use cases. I've built out virtual mocks for creating accounts. And I've added, let's say, like different delays and things like that through a script. So you get some of the, just any functionality you can do with a Groovy script, you can do here. So again, no limitation within ReadyAPI. So I'm going to leave it as sequence. And then this is our response. So using what was currently done in the projects tab, ServiceV actually recorded what that sample response was and put it into our body. All right. So now I can come in and say, change it up. Maybe I want to add some bad data in here to do some negative tests against. I can see it in the outline section. I can see the different headers that are available. And I can write a script to maybe add some more complex logic. All right. So with each response, we can add the status code and media type as well. And just to show you how the empty response looks like, it's just empty. You can start filling out information you want here. You can change this or type in a new media type if it's not available in our dropdown. And we have all the status codes available. All right. So that's how to create a virt from APIs you already have, or you want to record from an internal browser. That's definitely something you can do. I want to take a second here and ask, are there any questions? So ServiceV looks like an automagical product, but it does a lot of different things in the background. And I hope through this 101 session, you get a little bit more into what virtualization means and how to visualize that a little more. So let's see, we got a couple things on chat here. How do we track how many people hit the website? By the website, I am gonna assume you mean the vert. And we have a transaction log feature that there's currently nothing here, but if I start hitting this localhost 8080 with the correct endpoint, I'll see all that incoming and outgoing information. So I can start, maybe I'm a vert admin and I can start looking at what's happening and see exactly what's happening in terms of incoming and outgoing request and response. Okay, so that's how you can track. You can use it to see how many people, but you can also go deeper and see what they're actually doing, what they're trying to do with your vert. So the one you did is recorded. What if I don't have any such, but only the sample response? In that case, how do you proceed? So I'll show you that in a second. So that's not something I'll go into too much, but with our route and record functionality, you can actually point to a real service. And what ServiceV will do now is act as an intermediary between you, the user making the API calls, and the actual service. And what you do is you ping the local host, and if ServiceV has a response that it knows, it'll send you that response, something that's recorded in the vert. Now, if it's something it doesn't know, what it'll do is it'll ping the real service, record what that real response was, and then send you that response. So, and then what you see as you run 5, 10, 15 requests is this repository of responses being generated. Then you can, let's say it's down for maintenance, you can then turn off the routing options, look at the responses it has, maybe make some modifications in the same way that this populated information automatically. But I don't actually know what the service is doing. I just set up ServiceV to see what's going on, and ServiceV will learn from that, okay? So that is more what fits your use case. And in our later seminars, we talk more about that. It's just more of an advanced functionality that we don't really go over in our getting started. So if that doesn't make sense, feel free to ping the chat again. And, oh, you said thank you. So I assume I was coherent enough to make sense. Yeah, so a lot of very cool functionality here. Now, what I want to go over is our behavior tab. So let's say you have a virtual service that you're using in your testing workflow, but you want it to mock a real life server in a certain sense. What you can do is utilize these different sections like hardware to simulate server capacity, min, max threads, maybe some response delay you want to embed, maybe network, like some bandwidth, some latency or congestion. And you can just embed error codes so that it sends, after any amount of seconds, it sends a couple of 404s and then it goes back to normal. So you can do this so that you start mimicking real hardware so that when you build out your testing workflow, it's a bit more realistic. Because at some point you might, dependency comes out of maintenance and you want to switch back to that, you will be closer to more of a realistic scenario. So that's our behaviors tab. Now, everything I did just now, creating this virtual service, is only available on my local machine. So I can go to SoapUI, ping this local host, build out my testing workflow. It's great if it's just me. But what if you have a team of people that aren't designing a virtual service, but they need access to a virtual service? We actually offer a product called Vert Server, which acts as a server hub so that you can start putting out your mocks, your virtual services into the company network. So if we see here, this is my virtual service that's only available locally. And the bottom screen, that is my Vert Server instance. And we can see the different mocks that are already set there. None of them are running. We can look at the transaction log of what happened historically for my virtual Vert Server virtual services, response request. I can see the activity. So this is different from the transaction log. This is just admin activities on the Vert server. It's things like update, start, deployed, removed. And I can see some metrics on number of deployed, running servers, total failures, total responses sent, or responses sent, requests received. So this is a great way to then now have a team of testers accessing this virtual service so that you can test against it. And now one thing I want to show you is our web UI for admins who maybe don't have a ServiceV license, so they can't really come on to ReadyAPI. So with this web UI, you can actually see a lot of the same information you just saw within ServiceV. You can run, you can start any of these mocks, you can see what's been going on, you can set up different log files and a transaction log, and you can generate reports on what's going on with your Vert server. So that's our web UI aspect of that. All right. So that's ServiceV at a very high level, how to get started with creating a virtualized service, either from something that exists or something that doesn't exist. And we touched upon our route and record function. Some of the things I want to also speak to is that you can build out like simple authentication, either basic or something more complex with OAuth 2. This light simulation is just so that you can either, one, protect the virtual service when you put it up into Vert server, or you can actually have it, there for testing purposes. Another thing you can do is utilize a data source. Let's say I'll use my data generator here, add a property. Let's just say session ID is a property here. And I can start generating random custom strings here where, or let's just say GUIDs, where I can now embed randomized data into my responses. So it makes it a little bit more realistic feel to those end users that might be calling the virtualized service. And that can be added in this data source section. So let me just close this up. This data source section. So on the bottom of the screen here. So I can add that first data source and then pull it into the response using the get data functionality. So that's how data sources are used within ServiceV. Okay. So that's ServiceV Pro at a high level. I hope that you guys can understand it a little better, understand what virtualizing services means, and take a hard look at what your company processes are. Maybe you're looking at an internal dependency that goes down far too often. ServiceV fits that use case. It fits many different use cases, and I'm astounded when I talk to customers about it and they're doing X or Y, and I'm like, I never thought of doing that. That's very cool. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for coming.